Numbers 15. Let's start there. Numbers chapter 15. Glad to see everybody here tonight. Hope you are having a good week so far. We didn't quite get finished with this chapter last Wednesday, and there's a lot in it, in the whole thing, but some important stuff to talk about tonight. And then chapter 16, man, it's just full of good stuff. So appropriate for us right now. All right, so we're chapter 15, starting in verse 30. Last week, you remember, we were talking about unintentional sin. Well, starting in verse 30, talks about presumptuous sin. And so, your first blank, presumptuous sin refers to intentional or high-handed sin. This is, as opposed to unintentional, which we all do. We all commit sin unintentionally. We can also commit sin intentionally. This is, I know what your word says, and I'm going to do the exact opposite. High-handed sin. What was the punishment for high-handed sin? He's going to be cut off from among the people. He's broken the commandment. He shall be utterly cut off. His iniquity shall be upon him. And so, in both of my Bibles, there's a marginal reading there for verse 30. Put to death. And you actually have an incident of that happening, not only here in this very chapter. How soon did this event happen? We're just told, you start reading in verse 32, while they were in the wilderness, this is what happened. Did it happen immediately after this law was given? I don't know. Doesn't really matter. But it illustrates what's going on and what God means by intentional sin and the seriousness of this mentality that people can have in regard to, I'm going to do just what I want to do. And if we think people are any different today, then we're fooling ourselves, aren't we? People do what they want to do. We know that. And sadly, sometimes those who call themselves Christians are like that. I'm just going to do what I want to do. The punishment, again, cut off from among his people, and I think verses 32, as I put it in your outline, through 36, explain presumptuous sin. So let's look at that here. While the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man that gathered sticks upon the Sabbath day. And they that found him gathering sticks brought him unto Moses and Aaron and unto all the congregation. And they put him in ward, because it was not decided or declared what should be done to him. So obviously the people who found this situation knew he wasn't doing what was right. You don't work on the Sabbath day. We're going to look at Exodus 31 here in a minute. In fact, somebody wants to read that. Go ahead and be turning over, one of you, to Exodus 31, and I'll get to you in a second. They put him in ward until they could decide what needed to be done. The Lord said unto Moses, the man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones without the camp. And all the congregation brought him without the camp and stoned him with stones. And he died, as the Lord commanded Moses. All right. Who has Exodus 31, 12 through 17? Thank you. Listen to this next phrase right here.
Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed.
Okay, so verse 14 right there helps us understand what it means, he shall be cut off from among his people, because that's the punishment for the presumptuous sin, right? The intentional sin of Numbers chapter 15. So Exodus 31:14, he shall surely be put to death. He shall surely be cut off from among the people. Verse 15, he shall surely be put to death. There's no question what the penalty is for violating the Sabbath law. And the Sabbath, while it's not a law from creation, it's a law that appeals to creation. The Sabbath law, who else wants to read for me? I got another verse here. It's not in your outline. All right, go to Nehemiah chapter 9, and I want you to read verses 13 and 14. The Sabbath law was not established at creation, but the Sabbath law is connected to it. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and all that in them is, and he rested on the seventh day. All right, listen to Nehemiah 9, 13 and 14.
Thou camest down also upon Mount Sinai, and spakest with them from heaven, and gavest them right judgments, and true laws, good statutes, and commandments, and madest known unto them thy holy Sabbath, and commandedest them precepts, statutes, and laws by the hand of Moses thy servant.
Where were they when they got the Sabbath law? Mount Sinai. That's Exodus chapter 20. In another passage that's not in your outline, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 through 3, Moses tells the Israelites, God gave this law to us. He then enumerates the 10 commandments, which includes the Sabbath. He said, he didn't give this law to our fathers. Well, the fathers of the Israelites are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So there's a very common belief that we should still be honoring the Sabbath day today because it started at creation, and it did not. There's no Sabbath law. And Moses himself said it wasn't given to anybody before us. It's given to us who are here today. And it was at Mount Sinai. So, perpetual covenant throughout your generations is said to the Israelites. And that's what it was throughout there. So long as the nation of Israel stood as God's covenant people, as long as that covenant stood, they kept the Sabbath, yes. So there's a lot learned there in Exodus chapter 31. The first thing you learn is that it's a sign between God and the children of Israel. It's not for everybody. You and I are not children of Israel. We're not Jewish people. We are Gentiles. So anyway, it was a sign between God and His people. Again, it's connected, yes, to the creation in the sense of God working on 6 days, working for 6 days and resting on the seventh. And then, of course, you have the punishment that is to be inflicted. Any questions or comments on that? Exodus 31, 12 to 17, Deuteronomy 5, 1 through 3, and Nehemiah 9, 13 and 14, I think all help us understand what exactly is going on here in Numbers 15, verses 30 to 36. Intentional sin, which working on the Sabbath day is an intentional violation of the law. Everybody knew this law. And again, the people who saw this man doing this obviously knew the law. We need to get him in custody because he's breaking the law. And when you look at this account, back to Numbers 15 now, particularly verse 34, they didn't take it upon themselves to decide his fate, did they? They waited for a word from God. And you kind of see that early on with the Israelites. And we'll see it again right here in Numbers chapter 16. Okay. Any questions or thoughts on presumptuous or intentional sin? This would fall under the category, okay, if we're talking about the New Testament, would be something like 1 John 5:17. All unrighteousness is sin. You do something that is not right in the sight of God. That's an intentional violation of His revealed will. 1 John 3 and verse 4. Whoever sins transgresses the law because sin is the transgression of the law. That's intentional. You know what God says and you're going to go on and go against His revealed will anyway. Yeah. Yep. You're talking about Romans 6 there? Yeah, shall we keep on sinning? Yeah. Well, that was the idea Paul was kind of preemptively answering something that somebody might object to. Because back in Romans 5, where sin abounded, he said, this is verse 20 of Romans 5, where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. And so, as Paul's writing by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he has that capacity to know, well, somebody might object to that by saying, well, if that's true, if where sin abounded, grace abounded much more, then let's sin more and we'll get more grace. And that's why chapter 6 is written. The entirety of chapter 6 answers that question preemptively. All right, Numbers 15, verses 37 to 41. This is interesting. So here's unintentional sin. Here's intentional sin. Here's an example of intentional sin being commanded. So how can you keep all this in your mind? The Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make them fringes in the borders of their garments throughout all their generations, and that they put upon the fringe, the borders, a riband of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that you may look upon it, and remember all of the commandments of the Lord, and do them. And then I've got this underlined in my Bible. And that ye seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you used to go a-whoring. The reading from the New King James there at the end of verse 39, that you may not follow the harlotry to which your own heart and your own eyes are inclined. It's a reminder. So somebody turn over to Matthew 23, and I want you to read verses 1 through 5, because these fringes that are mentioned here, these tassels, as the New King James calls it, are mentioned in Matthew 23, 1 through 5. Just go ahead and read it, whoever it is, when you get there. Okay. That part about the phylacteries, it's a weird word. Phylacteries and the borders of their garment. Well, the phylacteries were pieces of leather. We know this from history, that they would attach to those fringes that God commanded them to make here. And what they started doing in time was they would take these pieces of leather and start writing scripture on them. And so, it's a reminder. Well, they did it for show. If in what Emily just read there, all their works they do to be seen by men. That's not the borders of your garments, the tassels, the fringe on the edge of your garments, your sleeves, the bottom, whatever it is, wherever it was. That wasn't to impress people. It had a specified purpose. And that's what Jesus is addressing there in Matthew 23. They made it something to impress people. God had initially established that, verse 40 of Numbers 15, that you may remember and do all my commandments. It's just a reminder. When I see that fringe, I can remember I shouldn't pick up sticks on the Sabbath day. I shouldn't take the Lord's name in vain. Whatever you could think of, it was a reminder. So that's the, you might say, the background of Matthew 23 in verses 1 through 5. Any questions or comments on that? Not a whole lot to add to it, just pretty straightforward.
Mary, what that look like with the whole congregation stoning? That meant they all agreed, or did each one of them pick up a stone?
I don't know. They obviously all agreed to it. Did every single Israelite pick up a stone and hit him with it? I don't know. That would be well over 1 million rocks. What it would look like would be a mess. But I don't know how it was carried out precisely. Maybe it's a consensus that it be done and then you just carry it out. All right. Sabbath day was strictly a day of rest. They had a very limited, like in Acts chapter 1, the journey from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem was called a Sabbath day's journey. It's approximately 2/3 of a mile. You couldn't travel any further than that. The Old Testament, I can't remember the reference off the top of my head, but don't even light a fire in your house. No work at all. And so that's one of the things that help us understand that so many people have a misconception about it is, particularly like Seventh-day Adventism. They call it a day of worship. It was not a day of worship. You do nothing on the Sabbath day. So there's some misunderstandings about it, but the Old Testament's very clear. You don't do anything. I mean, except for the necessities, obviously. But no work is to be done. And that's why even like back in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, when it's enumerating, okay, what do you mean by work? Your animals, your male servants, your female servants, nobody does any work on the Sabbath day. Yep.
Or Paul gathering together on like 3 Sabbaths in a row to discuss scriptures.
Yep.
I think that's where some of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You see the synagogues, I mean, that's what they did all throughout Acts. But they went there to preach the gospel, right? They went there to, like Acts chapter 17, he opened and alleged from the scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. He wasn't observing Judaism as such. He was, those who were, he was preaching the gospel to them. That's a good point. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, let's do Numbers chapter 16 here. I mean, this chapter, it's 50 verses long, but there's so much in here that is applicable. So I just titled this chapter, Rebellion, Complaints, and Punishment. This is the rebellion of Korah. In the New Testament, this is mentioned in Jude, specifically Jude, verse 11. For some reason I didn't put that in the outline, but there you go, Jude 11. Korah, this is a man of Kohath. The Kohathites, you go back to Numbers chapter 4, they were the ones who were, well, do any of you remember what the Kohathites were tasked with doing in regard to the tabernacle? Yeah, they had to pick the stuff up with the poles and carry it. Good job. So Korah, and then you got 3 other people who are from the tribe of Reuben, Dathan, Abiram, and On, and then 250 people besides them rebel. They gather against Moses and Aaron, and here's your first blank in this section. This is a power struggle from entitled people who felt that they deserved more power. All right, I guess those are your first 2 blanks. First one is entitled. The second one is power. So you have them named there in verse 16. In verse 1 of chapter 16. They rose up before Moses with certain of the children of Israel. And these aren't just anybody. That's the thing here. 250 men of Israel, princes of the assembly, famous in the congregation, men of renown. There's like 3, what would you say, exclamatory statements? That's not that. Explanatory statements of who these guys are. They're not just nobodies. These are prominent men in the nation of Israel. They gathered themselves together against Moses. That's a significant word. Against. They're not going to talk to him about something. They're setting themselves up against Moses and against Aaron, verse 3. And listen to the language here. You guys have too much power. You've taken too much upon yourselves. All the congregation are holy. I think this is the congregation of the 250 because they've all come. I think they're saying, all of us are holy. You've got too much power concentrated in you two. We're good. Every one of them. The Lord's among them. Listen to this. Wherefore then lift ye up yourselves above the congregation of the Lord. What's the problem here with their premise? Well, what is their premise about Moses and Aaron? Yeah. Yeah. You guys have taken this upon yourselves. And that's what I put in your outline there. Notice the claim at the end of verse 3. You've lifted yourselves up. Moses hears it and he falls on his face. Moses knows what's about to happen, I think. This is not the first encounter like this that Moses has had. Moses makes intercession, I think, a couple of different times in this chapter. Falls on his face, spoke to Korah and to all the company. God's going to make that decision. They come up against Moses. You guys come back tomorrow. This is verses 4 through 7. God would make the choice apparent as to who the leaders were. Moses and all of Israel, for that matter, here's the thing, everybody knew. Somebody read verse 7 here.
And put fire therein, put incense in them before the Lord tomorrow, and it shall be that the man whom the Lord doth choose, he shall be holy. Ye take too much upon him, ye sons of Levi.
Moses turns the tables, doesn't he? No, it's you. You're taking too much upon yourselves. God will make this clear. But that's the thing. Everybody knew. You go all the way back to Exodus chapter 3 when Moses is essentially bargaining with God about what he will and will not do. God says, you're going, Aaron can be your mouthpiece. But you're going. And when he's 80 years old, that's when that happens, and we know essentially the rest of that story in terms of them leading the children of Israel out. So, gather together, we'll come back tomorrow, and God will make this decision very plain before you. What you have then in verses 8 through 11, Korah is rebuked for his sin. And again, I don't think this is insignificant when you're looking at this account starting in verse 8. Korah already has a significant part in the functioning of the camp of Israel. He's a Kohathite. He's in charge, I guess you could say it that way, of the holy vessels of the tabernacle. But look what's said here in verse 9. Does it seem like something small? The King James says, seemeth it but a small thing unto you? Is your current position insignificant? God separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to Himself, to do the service of the tabernacle, to stand before the congregation, to minister unto them. So you want more than what God has already given you? He's brought you near to Him, verse 10, and all thy brethren, the sons of Levi, with thee. You want the priesthood now too? You want Aaron's position? And that there's something there that Moses knew that I don't think is explicitly stated in the text, but it's like he wants Aaron's spot. And he's rebuked for that. So, in reality, next blank, in reality, Korah's complaint was with God, because God decided who's going to serve as what and in what capacity. Look at verse 11. For which cause both thou and all thy company, the 250 people, are gathered together. What does he say? Gathered together, what? Against the Lord. This has nothing to do with me and Aaron. Your conflict is with God. The position you want to talk to God about that, and we'll do that. We'll do that tomorrow. So verses 12 through 15, you've got these other two guys, Dathan and Abiram. They're told to assemble, and they just outright refuse. Okay? I mean, we will not come up, the end of verse 12 says. That's a pretty bold thing to say to Moses. And as if that were not enough, we're not going to come up. Is it a small thing? So they're using the language that Moses used against Korah. Is it a small thing that God has done this? Well, is it a small thing that you, verse 13, have brought us up out of the land that flowed with milk and honey? Now, they were promised to go to a land that flowed with milk and honey, right? I mean, that's what the entire nation of Israel was promised. And what do they call Egypt? The land that flowed with milk and honey, a place where they'd been for 400 years captives under rigorous conditions, according to Exodus chapter 1. I guess comparatively, relatively speaking, maybe it felt that way. You know, in Hebrews chapter 11 talks about if they had had any desire to go back to Egypt, they would have. But God wouldn't allow them. Anyway, you've brought us out of a land that flows with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness. Except thou make thyself altogether a prince over us. And there again is that accusation. You have exalted yourself. And so they again say at the end of verse 14, we will not come up. Well, they come up. The next day they come up. So looking at your outline here, it's interesting. And the way I put it in your outline here, Dathan and Abiram refused Moses' directive to assemble before God the next day. They didn't need any outside leadership. They could do it themselves. I mean, that's kind of the point of rebellion. You're not happy with the current leadership, and so we'll just usurp them, we'll undermine them, and take it upon ourselves. You want that kind of a leader who's willing to usurp or undermine the current leadership and take the power for themselves? Probably not a good quality to have in a leader who's underhanded and sneaky. I might have taken God up on the, hey, I'm going to destroy all these people. I might be like, okay, that'll work. Yeah. Well, how many times does he intercede for them? I mean, repeatedly. And I think that's part, going back to Numbers chapter 12, and it's verse 3, you have that parenthetical statement there. They're complaining about who he married, and then you have that parenthetical statement in verse 3 that Moses was the meekest man on the face of the earth. He's going to let a lot of stuff slide. God will not. Because these people, these rebels, are trying to undermine the very man that God chose to lead them. Verses 16 through 19, the command to appear before the Lord is restated. They were to appear with their censers, which tells me that these people had a part in the priesthood to some extent. What it looked like, we're not told, but they had censers. And God would clarify for the congregation who was in charge. Somebody read here verses 20 and 21. So the assembly's made, all right? They've done, everybody's there. The distinction's going to be made clear. Somebody read verses 20 and 21.
And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment.
Well, there's your decision. That didn't take very long, did it? And the way I put it in your outline, God clarifies. Here's your next blank. We must be directed by words from God, not a sense of entitlement. They wanted more power. Whether they felt Moses and Aaron were inadequate, which seemingly they did think that. You brought us out here to die. We'll do so much better. Well, we need, when it comes to decisions for God's people, here's one of these practical application points from your Old Testament. In terms of leadership among God's people, we need words from God. We don't just take it upon ourselves to do what we want to do. And I've illustrated that. I've preached, over 11 years, I've preached sermons on this type of subject in terms of like change that's being pushed in the church and things like this. You will always hear this. This is without exception. I've heard it, I don't know how many times over the years, when congregations will change their name, they'll change their style of worship as they call it, and they'll say, we've restudied this over the last 6 months. I want you to think about how arrogant that statement is. So we've had Scripture for millennia, and you have studied for 6 months, and you've come up with something different. Where have you been all this time? It's like, how have we done anything without your mind that you've just revealed took 6 months to change? Were you wrong before? Or are you wrong now? And what were you studying? What were you going to say? Oh, it's everything. We've restudied this. So if God spoke on this, and it's clear, regardless of the topic, what are you studying now that you didn't have before that's changed? And again, like I said, I'm speaking in congregational terms. A lot of times it starts with preachers. So if I ever say anything like that, come talk to me. All right? Just come talk to me.
In addition to what you're studying, who you're studying with is just as important because having something help translate into a language you speak is different than having someone interpret the meaning of what was translated.
Sure.
And I think we culturally get a lot of interpretations based off of feelings and preferences that don't actually go with a direct translation of the words on page.
Yeah. And I'll give you a good example of this. And particularly within churches of Christ in the last couple of decades, you see it more and more. It's the role of women in the church, and in a variety of ways. Public speaking, being deacons. They have, to my knowledge, I've not seen a Church of Christ try to appoint female elders yet. It's coming, if they're not yet already. But certainly deaconesses. 1 Timothy chapter 2 speaks to this. They'll say, well, that was cultural. That was just going on. That was something going on in Ephesus. And so whatever they were dealing with, we're not dealing with, so that text doesn't apply today because we don't live in the culture they lived in. And when you read the Bible, you have to interpret. But that text interprets it for you because it gives two reasons for the roles of the males versus the roles of the females. One, Adam was created first, which tells me whatever was going on or was trying to be going on in Ephesus, where Timothy was, had nothing to do with culture, because Paul appeals back to creation, and he appeals to what happened with the deception of Eve. It didn't have anything to do with a cultural practice in the city of Ephesus in the first century. So it's interesting to think about that. And what you say, who they're studying with, what material they're using, things like this. We need words from God. Yeah, rightly dividing. Second, that word is so interesting. Rightly dividing, it's a compound word, and it literally means to cut straight. Is it the American Standard Version that says handling aright the word of truth? Why is it? Think of how the Bible is described. Okay, Jeremiah compares the Bible to fire. He compares the Bible to a hammer. What does the New Testament compare the Scriptures to a couple of times? A sword? Can you think of anything else? I'm asking. Hammer, fire, sword. That'll do. Do you just handle those things carelessly? Hammers and fires and swords? No. But that's what the Bible's compared to because of its nature, what it's intended to do. So you have to cut it straight. You've got to handle it carefully. And that doesn't happen necessarily easily. It takes work. So God makes the decision. Here's who's leading. And I think a parallel for us is we must be directed by words from God. So verses 22 through 35, a larger section here, Moses separated the rebels from the rest of Israel. And the text tells us, if God does a new thing, you're going to know that this is what his decision was. Well, the new thing was the rebels are in their place, Korah and all of them, and what happened to them? The earth opened up and swallowed them alive. Well, that's a new thing. Nobody had seen that before. They were identified as wicked men throughout the text. And so here's something else. When a person presumes upon God, and that's exactly what Korah, Dathan, and Abiram and these 250 people did. They presumed upon God. We're not happy with the current situation. We want to change. God had already decided how it was going to be. So when a person presumes upon God and is divisive, he is called wicked. That's your next blank. I don't care how long you've known him. I don't care how nice of a person he or she is. If they presume upon God, they are wicked. And, the text tells us that. Somebody turn over real quick to Titus chapter 3, and I want you to read verse 10. Titus 3:10. And listen to the end of Numbers 16:30. They're going to go down alive into the pit. Then you, Israel, y'all will understand that these men have rejected the Lord. When you presumptuously reject God, you know what He said, but you go directly against His will in an effort to build yourself up in the sight of people, you've rejected God and you're a wicked person. Titus 3:10, somebody.
Rejected a divisive man after the first and second admonition.
The King James says reject a heretic. You've heard that word heretic. Well, that's actually the Greek word. It's one of those words that the King James just pulled the Greek letters and made an English word out of it. Reject a divisive man after the first and second admonition. What? Read the next little part there.
Knowing that such a person is warped and sinning, being self-condemned.
He's condemned himself. And that's exactly what Numbers chapter 15 says. Look at verse 38. Numbers 16:38. The censors of these men who sinned against their own souls. They were warped and they deceived themselves. They thought they could alter God's hierarchy. And that's not how that works. And when you try that, you're wicked and you will be held accountable. You need to be held accountable, and if we're going to make modern application, in the church, but God's going to hold you accountable ultimately if you don't repent. Well, then, of course, verse 35, the 250 are consumed by fire. We're about out of time, so let me move on through this. The censers of the rebels were used as gold plating for the altar, and that was used as a memorial. And I said again, notice how their sin is described in verse 38. They sinned against their own souls. The very next day, get that. Everybody has seen this happen, right? Everybody has heard God speak. The very next day, Israel accused Moses and Aaron of killing the rebels. It's like, are you kidding me? How stubborn and willfully ignorant can you be? But that's where the congregation of Israel was. Moses and Aaron intercede for the people. A plague from God comes upon the people, and approximately 15,000 people die. Aaron runs into the middle of the plague and stops the plague, doesn't he? And I put that in your outline here. Number one, how might I react? If I saw these rebels doing that and they were fighting against me, I might be thinking, that's exactly what they deserve. But that's not Moses and that's not Aaron. And then I asked this question, do you think Korah would have done something like that? You think Korah would have run into the middle of them and tried to stop the plague? Probably not, because he didn't want them there in the first place. He wanted the power. So there's a lot in that chapter to take practical application from. Okay. Any questions or comments?
Presumably, Moses and Aaron would have been perfectly within reason to say, sure, God, go ahead.
Yeah, Aaron didn't have to jump in the middle and stop the plague. Right? But he did. It's interesting to think about.